Tristan stirred his matcha tea, watching the murky liquid swirl as the bag bobbed up and down. He took a tentative sip, immediately regretting it. The taste reminded him of damp grass and something worse, an aftertaste of regret. Pan grimaced, setting the cup down as he left the break room, his steps heavy with exhaustion. The mirrored elevator doors reflected a version of himself he barely recognized. Tired eyes, a mouth set in a firm, joyless line. The strands of premature gray creeping along his temples only deepened his discontent. He had spent the entire morning locked in endless meetings, taking notes, nodding along as executives spoke in circles. It was the same routine, the same empty promises of progress. A few more years of this, he reminded himself. Just a few more years proving his worth, climbing the ladder. As he waited for the elevator, Tristan took another sip of his matcha and shuddered at the taste. That was when he noticed the old man standing beside him, as if he had appeared out of nowhere. Ancient, yet oddly alert, the man studied Tristan with an amused glint in his eye, as if he could read every thought that had just crossed his mind. The stranger commented on Tristan's tea, pointing out that it wasn't his usual choice. His voice carried a knowing tone, as if he had seen this moment play out countless times before. Tristan nodded absently, muttering something about switching from coffee on his girlfriend's suggestion. The old man chuckled at that, shaking his head. Another one, he remarked. Another young worker blindly following orders, unable to think for himself. The words struck a nerve. Tristan clenched his jaw, but refused to rise to the bait. He had no desire to argue with a stranger, especially not in his workplace. But the man wasn't finished. He spoke of wasted time, of people like Tristan waiting for life to hand them what they wanted instead of seizing it for themselves. The words dripped with something unsettling, pity, disappointment. Tristan finally turned to face him, his patience thinning. What was the old man's problem? Instead of answering, the man reached into his coat and pressed something against Tristan's chest. A folded sheet of paper, ancient and brittle, as though it had survived centuries. The old man's expression grew serious as he explained that it was a map, one that led to something beyond Tristan's understanding. A reward, he called it, a chance to escape the cycle Tristan had trapped himself in. Skepticism twisted in Tristan's gut. A treasure map? Was this some elaborate prank? But the conviction in the man's voice was unwavering. He had received this same map decades ago, he claimed, but had wasted years ignoring it. Now he was passing it on, fulfilling a debt. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the man was gone. The elevator dinged, its doors sliding open, but Tristan hardly noticed. He was staring at the fragile paper in his hands. Days passed, and despite telling himself it was nonsense, Tristan found himself unable to forget the encounter. When he asked around the office, no one seemed to recall seeing the old man. He shouldn't have cared. He shouldn't have let the mystery consume him. But it did. Then one evening, without a word to anyone, Tristan packed a bag and left. The journey led him across forgotten roads, through forests and empty fields, until he found himself standing before an impossible sight. The labyrinth stretched before him, its towering walls of dark stone disappearing into the horizon. The air hung heavy with silence, unnatural and expectant. At the center of it all, a massive archway stood open, as if inviting him inside. A trick of the light, or perhaps his own imagination, made it seem like shadows curled around its edges, eager to swallow him whole. Tristan hesitated. The map had led him here, but now it gave no further instructions. He turned it over in his hands, searching for something, anything, to guide him deeper. A whisper, soft as wind through dead leaves, drifted through the air. "Find me." His breath hitched. He spun around, but the valley was empty. No one was there. The whisper came again, drifting from the depths of the labyrinth. Pulse hammering, Tristan took a step forward. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the world shifted. The distant hum of nature, chirping insects, rustling grass, fell into absolute silence. Tristan turned sharply, his stomach knotting in horror. The entrance was gone. Where there had been an open archway moments ago, now there was only an unbroken expanse of stone. No seams, no gaps, no way back. Panic surged through him, but before it could take hold, the map in his hands began to change. The old, faded ink shifted, new lines forming before his eyes. A detailed rendering of the labyrinth unfolded, each corridor and dead end sketched in perfect precision. And there, at the very center, an empty square marked the final destination. He had no choice now. Swallowing his fear, Tristan turned toward the path the map laid out for him and stepped forward. Hours passed, perhaps days. The labyrinth twisted endlessly, its halls shifting behind him with each turn. Shadows loomed in the corners of his vision, and though he never saw them clearly, he knew he wasn't alone. Then came the fork in the path. The map told him to go right, but something unseen, called to him from the left. The air felt different down that corridor. Warmer, familiar, in a way he couldn't explain. His body swayed toward it, his feet almost moving on their own. He could feel something waiting there. Something incredible. But then the whisper came again, urgent this time. "Find me." The spell broke. Heart pounding, Tristan turned away from the tempting path and followed the map's instructions. He never looked back. The center of the labyrinth was nothing like he expected. A clearing stretched out before him, bathed in an eerie silver light. At its heart stood a raised stone platform, and upon it a mirror. The frame gleamed, intricate and ancient, and yet the surface itself rippled as though it were made of liquid. Tristan stepped forward cautiously, his breath shallow. Then the whisper, so familiar now, came one final time. But this time he recognized the voice, his own. Dread clawed its way up his spine. He stared into the mirror, expecting his reflection. Instead, he saw a face he knew all too well, the old man. The stranger from the office grinned at him from the other side of the glass. But something was wrong. His features were changing, growing younger. His hair darkened, wrinkles fading, until he no longer looked ancient. Until he looked exactly like Tristan. A cold, clawing force gripped Tristan's chest. He gasped, stumbling back, only to see his hands trembling, thin, frail, the skin shriveling before his eyes. The man in the mirror, his mirror image, watched with an expression of twisted satisfaction. Tristan tried to scream, but the force yanked him forward, pulling him into the depths of the glass. His world dissolved into shadow. The next morning, a young man stepped out of the labyrinth, stretching his arms as if waking from a long slumber. He unfolded a brittle piece of paper, smoothing out the creases before tucking it into his coat pocket. Then, with a satisfied smile, he disappeared into the world, just another stranger with a story to tell.